everyone. Good afternoon. So I'm going to get this started. One of our panelists is running a little late. She'll join us as she gets in. Given this weather, well, today is beautiful, but given the weather prior to this, it's not surprising that folks have some transportation issues. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being at the conference and for being in this session in particular. When the organizers asked me to moderate this session, I'm Farrah Griffin, by the way, asked me to moderate this session, I was really excited about bringing together these issues of reparative justice and reparations. There are conversations that it's important we have come together, especially around issues of incarceration as well. We have an extraordinary panel today, and I'm going to introduce them briefly. I'll pose some questions for them, and they will respond to those, respond to each other, and there will be plenty of time for your questions and comments and all that good stuff. So our panelists, I will introduce them not in the order that they are in your program, but in the order that they will speak. Our panelists are Piper Anderson, who is the founder and chief creative strategist, Create Forward. Cassandra Frederique, who is the New York State Director of the Drug Policy Alliance, and Joey Mogul, co-founder of the Chicago Torture Justice Memorial, also a partner in People's Law Practice. And then later on, who will join us is Virginie Ladish, senior staff member of the International Center for Transitional Justice. She'll be joining us in just a few when she gets here. I thought to start off the question, because so many people have a sort of different idea of what reparations mean. It's one of those terms that we all think we know, and we do know, basically, but that there are some nuances and some complexities and ways of thinking about reparations that I think our panelists can help us sort of think about in a little more complicated ways. So one of the questions I asked them to consider, or I suggested, is that it would be very helpful if each of them could give us a working definition, their working definition of reparations and how they understand it. People tend to have a very set notion of the concept of reparations and thus a fairly limited understanding of the possibility of asking for and acquiring them. So I think that their responses might broaden as well as complicate received understandings of reparations. So in your comments, in your opening comments, if you could think about a working definition of reparations that we can all take away. I'll start with Piper.
I kind of feel like we should go the other way, but that's fine. I'm gonna go ahead. Well, I think one of the things that's really great about the makeup of this panel is that it includes, legal advocacy and cultural perspectives, and which are all encompassed within the reparative justice process, right? You have to think about the legal implications, you have to think about the policy implications, and you also have to think about the cultural part of it as well. How do we shift culture? How do we transform culture? Because within a successful, reparative justice process are all those things, and at the very end of it is there should be a mechanism for ensuring that the injustice never happens again, the harm never happens again. That's key, right? But I'm going to backtrack a little bit because I think, as Farrah said, we do have a kind of a limited understanding of reparations, and particularly in this country, in which, like one of my colleagues says, we love the idea of like truth and reconciliation, but we always jump to the reconciliation piece. We jump ahead to the, oh, I'm sorry, right? Like, and we see this a lot, right? And there are a lot of things that we haven't really contended with and reckoned with, particularly in the realm of racial violence. So how I came into this work is in 2015, in June 2015, my mother died. And she died of a drug overdose. And a few months later, and she had struggled with addiction for most of my life, And as a child, at 7 years old, I got to know pretty intimately what the drug war was, and how my family was a target of it. And then a few months, like 2 months after she died, I remember watching President Obama announce this kinder, more gentler war on drugs, this approach, this compassionate approach that we were going to now take to drug addiction. We were going to use language that wasn't stigmatizing, and all of this focus and all of these resources were being put into, not into Philadelphia where I grew up, but into small towns that were predominantly white, where the new crisis was. And I'm just gonna move on. Oh, we have a chair over here.
Oh, we have another chair?
Yep, chair's right here. we set Virginia up right, so she's got a seat right next to me. Welcome.
Thank you.
All I felt was anger. Mm-hmm. I felt anger and bitterness because I thought to myself, wow, what if that more compassionate, more humane approach had been used when my parents were struggling? My mother would probably still be here today. And then a few months after that, my niece disappeared. Her addiction to painkillers had turned into an addiction to heroin, and she was now missing, right? It's been 2 years later, and I still do not know where Asia is. So I lost two women in my life, two of the women who were closest to me in my entire life, and felt nothing but anger and a paralysis. And then decided, so while there was nothing that I could do about them, right, and the loss of, and my grief at the loss of losing them, there was a way in which I should also say that, the weekend my mother died, I was heading to the Allied Media Conference to lead a session called Drug War Survivors, which was about storytelling, and bringing together survivors of the drug war to tell their stories. And it was a part of a track there called Creative Grieving Practices. So I was thinking a lot about that, about storytelling and about grieving, as I was going through this, and thought, it is time for this country to reckon with the impact of incarceration. It is time for this country to really reckon with the impact of the drug war. And I began to start using the tools that I had available to me: storytelling, cultural organizing, and created a project called Mass Story Lab that uses a human rights framework of storytelling. And in that framework, storytelling is both relational, right, repairing the harm and the broken, the ruptures and the fissures of relationship that happens when violence happens, racial violence happens in communities, repairing the loss of connection to self and to each other, healing, right, through storytelling, through repairing relationship. And then the other piece of it is instrumental. Stories are instrumental in this process, and that by hearing the stories of people who have been most harmed, most affected, we begin to understand what justice looks like. So when I think about reparative justice, it includes those things, right? It includes the listening, the sharing, the documentation of stories of those who have been most affected, and then using that as the lens through which we begin to redefine justice. So we begin to define what healing and also what reparations looks like. And I think that, we often think about reparations as something that's monetary, but it could take so many different forms, right? It could include an actual curriculum that is taught throughout the school system, but it could include some of the things that we're going to probably hear about here from some of the other panelists. In District 6, in Cape Town, it looked like people who had been displaced and lost their homes to white settlers during apartheid, creating a physical map of their neighborhood, of what their neighborhood used to look like, and then putting a spot, an X, where they used to live, identifying where they used to live, and then taking that map along with their testimonials and using it as evidence that we used to live here and these places, and that was used as a campaign to help people regain their land. So it could look like restoring people's property rights. It could look like complete, transformation of the justice system in Missouri, with the Truth Telling Project, which came about after Mike Brown was killed. And online resources, right? So it can look like a lot of different things. It can look like policy change. But I think the thing that we want to always come back to is that ultimately it should always include a mechanism for making sure that it never happens again.
Here. So we'll go next to, I'm going to moderate from over here. So we'll go next to Cassandra. Is that good? It's okay. We agreed on speaking order before.
Agree is such a strong word. Yeah, it's a very strong word. I was voluntold.
Virginia, if you ever want to jump in. This is me stalling so that you all can get your minds back together after Piper gave you what she did, so you don't automatically judge me based on what she just did. So I work at Drug Policy Alliance, and I'm really always shocked when the social work school asks me to come speak here, because I'm very critical of the field of social work as someone who got their degree here in this school. I think one of the things that reparative justice, for me, how I got to this conversation, is really based on the organizing I did with other social workers around mass criminalization. And understanding that the conversation around mass incarceration is the right one, it's just not the full one, right? And really recognizing how criminalization as a strategy has been used to subjugate folks of color and folks across the gender spectrum and folks with different immigration statuses and poor people, right? And really figuring out how the engine of criminalization has been used to create systems and ideas and reinforce stigma around people that we think are undeserving, disposable, or just not useful. And so within the organizing around social workers against mass criminalization, one of our biggest ideas was mapping out what criminalization looked like and where was criminalization, and identifying where social workers were participating, right? Or acting on behalf of the state and being actors of state-sanctioned violence. And that project was huge, and we never did it because it was so big and we all had jobs. But what that really did for me was create a foundation of how to address the harms that have been done, and really pushing me to recognize that it's not just police officers and district attorneys and judges and politicians, but it's teachers, it's hospitals, it's social workers, it's the bodega guy, it's the tenant association, it's the landlord, and really figuring out who are all these actors. And when I started thinking about the different actors that are using criminalization as a strategy, I realized that there was a lot more reckoning that needed to happen than arresting law enforcement that killed Mike Brown, right? I realized that it was a lot more than calling for criminal justice reform. It was also calling for housing reform. It was also calling for immigration policy. It was also calling for child welfare reforms, right? It was really understanding how large and pervasive criminalization had become. And so part of my insistence on us thinking through what a reparative justice framework would look like is what was trying to figure out how do we create a container to expose the way that criminalization and social control had enveloped our communities. And what we found is that the issue, we can't take it on because most people don't even recognize how big it is. And people have really deep knowledge about one system, but not how it connects to another system. And so if we're having a conversation around truth, and we're having a conversation about reconciliation, we're only providing truth and reconciliation in parts and never in wholes. And so it's this conversation where there's the big picture and nobody can see and everyone's touching a different part and everyone has different ideas about what the picture is, right? Because they're blinded and they can only know what they're talking about. But are the people that are talking about truth and reconciliation in an immigration context connecting it to those that are looking for truth and reconciliation in a child welfare context? And what are those connections? Do they even exist? And are we creating one container or are we creating many containers? And if we're creating many containers, are we creating the integrative connective tissue that's necessary for us to create a whole process? And so when we talk about conversations around the controlling of people that we think are undeserving, in the field that I'm in, which talks about drugs, the moment that we're currently in around the kinder, gentler drug war rhetoric, right? Because I'm very clear that it is a rhetoric. 2014, 2015, 2016, Cassandra would have said here on camera that it was policies, but it is rhetoric. That in order to fully have a conversation about how to organize through pain and policy to save lives in the current overdose crisis, that we had to have a full conversation of all the ways the drug war was showing up. And so my colleague, Deanna King, has been working to create these systems conversations around where the drug war is showing up and how the drug war has impacted certain communities, how the drug war has impacted certain systems. So what does it look like for social services? What does it look like for employment? What does it look like for child welfare? What does it look like for immigration? And so these are conversations that we're having, but for us, it's like trying to figure out how we create the container. And so within our organization, people are like, yes, Cassandra, you started saying reparative justice, so let's put it on all the fact sheets. And I'm like, actually, we still don't know what that looks like, right? And being accountable and truthful to the real pain. Because oftentimes advocates want to create a process and put a new name on it and decide that that is how we're going to get to the truth. But, there's a constant quest for the truth. People spend their whole lives trying to get to the truth. And every book that you've read, from Michelle Alexander to Paul Butler to Carl Hart to Asha Bendelli and Patrice Marie Cullors to Andrea Ritchie, is still not the full truth. And so how do we create a container that centers repair? And how do we hold the systems and the entities and institutions accountable? Because one of the things that I'm very clear about is that when it comes to Black people, there's not much to restore to in the context of the United States, in the context of a Western society, in the context of colonialism, and in the context of imperialism. There is no Wakanda, right? Every part of every place we've been to has been touched by colonizers, right? And that's not just for Black folks. That's like, I'm not having a personal conversation with you, girl. I'm just looking at you, you're nodding. I'm like, girl, yes, there's no one here but me and you. But there is no place that has not been touched, right? And so recognizing that has to be essential. So it's not that I'm going to restore myself in this way, because it's about repairing the harms and actually holding institutions accountable. How do we create the container to hold institutions accountable and reimagine and transform the social contract that we're all supposed to be abiding by? And so for us, when it comes to the drug war, it's trying to figure out how has the drug war in this century impacted the systems that people interact with? And how do we create the change legislatively, administratively, and culturally? Which is exactly what you laid out. And what we found, and what we're finding, is that we won't hit the bottom. The best we can do, we won't hit the bottom. But we have to be truthful in that process. Because in presenting something that it's not, we create more harm.
Do you want but you need to go in.
Good afternoon. My name's Joey Mogul, and I'm proud to be a co-founder of Chicago Torture Justice Memorials, and I've been involved in the fight for reparations for the Chicago police torture survivors, otherwise known as the Burge torture survivors. Have people heard about the Chicago police torture cases? Okay, can you raise your hand? And then, have people heard about the reparations we won in 2015 for the Chicago? Okay, great. Before I begin, I just want to say that we're lucky to have two of my comrades in the room, Alice Kim and Sarah Ross, who are part of Chicago Torture Justice Memorials. And unfortunately, Miriam Cabo, who's also was part of us, was on the morning panel but can't be with us today. So I'm an activist. I'm a lawyer at the People's Law Office. So I tend to be a little element-orientated, okay? I tend to be a little detail-orientated. I wanted to start off by saying my conception of reparations has been informed, and I've been completely educated by Black activists, organizers, human rights advocates, and lawyers, particularly Standis Willis from Chicago, who works with the National Conference of Black Lawyers and who originally put out the call for reparations in the Burge torture cases. And I've had the privilege of being in spaces to learn from the centuries of activism that Black people have done in this country for reparations, for slavery, for Jim Crow, for lynching, and continually for the criminal legal system that people are being decimated by today. So I want to kind of step back and say, and I can't say that I know what reparative justice looks like. I just want to really talk about reparations and my understandings of that. I think if we step back and think, what are reparations? I think we need to dream and think that reparations is what we believe is a demand for social justice. Reparations is the struggle to get to the world we want to live in, where everyone has dignity, where everyone is respected, and where everyone has the right to self-determination. I think that we have to see it in a very expansive way, and there's no one set way for reparations for any particular harm. But for me, I want to say that reparations is a demand on the state. Now, that could also be a demand on the state, and the state then has to demand on corporations, but it's a demand on the powers that be that have caused the harm and oppression. That's right. And that's different than harm that's caused by civilians. And this is something that, we've fought for in the Chicago police torture cases. Over 120 Black men and women were tortured by Chicago police officers. And I don't say that word lightly. People were electrically shocked. They were suffocated with plastic bags, and they were brutally beaten with rubber blackjacks and rubber hoses in order to extract confessions that were then used against them to convict them, and in the case of 11, send them to Illinois death row. And people served decades in prison before they've been released. And in fact, we still have people in prison today who've never had a full and fair hearing with respect to the torture they endured. But when we use the word torture, let's be very clear. We are talking about state actors who commit acts of torture. And what upsets me is that when we talk about torture often, particularly in the media, they want to talk about it when it's one civilian engaging in violence against another. But when you see the torture committed by police officers, guards, prison officials, law enforcement officials, they never use the word torture, but that's when it's most applicable. And I think that's the same for reparations, okay? Reparations are a demand on the state. And I think when we think about what reparations are, we have to think about who is harmed. And that is so much beyond our definition in the U.S. legal system of who is harmed. It's not a one-on-one direct correlation. In the Burge torture cases, it wasn't just the individuals, the black men and women who were tortured and who were then wrongfully convicted, regardless of whether they were innocent or not of the crime they were accused. They were all wrongfully convicted. They were not the only ones harmed. Their families were harmed. The communities they came from were harmed. And so I think we have to think about who is harmed. We have to think about how people have been harmed. And then I think we need to think about what the state needs to do to meet the material needs of those who've been harmed. And so again, I think that, we always, often when people use the word reparations, they think financial compensation. And it is so much more than that. So when thinking about reparations in the Burge Torture Campaign, I looked to General Comment 3, which is to the UN Convention Against Torture. And we used international human rights both in seeking justice in the Burge torture cases. We went twice to the UN Committee Against Torture in Geneva, Switzerland, and were successful in getting findings from that body. But we also used the much more expansive concept of what reparations are under international law. And so some of those components include restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction and the right to tell the truth, and that's particularly this idea of the state having to acknowledge the violations that occurred, the harm that occurred, and then documenting that and memorializing that, and some of the work Piper and Cassandra you were talking about. And the hardest thing is the guarantees of non-refoulement, or guarantees of not happening again, which I think is the hardest thing for us to get. So I'll just to close this part, I just want to say, so in the Chicago police torture cases, which were decades in the making, what we, and I want to say, as Mariam was pointing out this morning, for so long, the struggle for the Burge torture survivors was about trying to get the guys who were behind bars new hearings and trying to get them freed, and that's still a struggle. And a lot of the struggle also was focused on prosecuting the police officers who were involved. And I was definitely someone who had drank the Kool-Aid on that. I was so deeply invested in that, to the point where I think often we weren't thinking about the other ways of accountability and other ways of seeking healing and about meeting the needs of the Chicago police torture survivors, their family members, and communities. And that's why we then moved to reparations. So in 2015, we were able, after we had a very hard-fought campaign in the city of Chicago in the midst of the mayoral and our city council elections, in May of 2015, we were able to get the city of Chicago agree to pass legislation, which included an official apology for the Chicago police torture scandal that occurred. That is now part of our laws. It included financial compensation for the Burge torture survivors, many of whom could never sue and get any money whatsoever for the torture they endured because the statute of limitations had expired so long ago, or because they remained convicted of the crimes that they were accused of, so therefore they didn't have any right to get into court. Our reparations included the creation of a psychological counseling center on the south side of Chicago where the torture occurred, to try to provide healing services to the torture survivors, their family members, and other individuals who are harmed by law enforcement officials. And so I'm really happy to be at this conference today because we really need help building that center. The reparations included teaching about the Burge torture cases to all 8th and 10th graders in the Chicago public schools. It included free enrollment in city colleges for the Burge torture survivors, their family members, and particularly their grandchildren. And we fought very hard for that because we said to the city, this legacy of harm went throughout generations, and you owe all generations this city colleges. The reparations includes the creation of a public memorial, which we are still in the process of trying to make. Although we've had lots of speculative memorials that were made and created and dreamed about that helped us get to reparations, which hopefully I can talk about later. And finally, the city has, as part of the reparations practice, allowed priority access to the Burge torture survivors for other city services. I'm not saying this is perfect. This is still a fight in the making. I mean, we are still fighting to get these reparations implemented, but that's what we've gotten to thus far in Chicago with respect to these cases.
Thank you very much. I think it's great to hear some success stories because, unfortunately, in reparations, it's one of the hardest things to achieve. So important, but it's really important to see where success can inspire the rest of us. My name is Virginie Ladish. I work with the International Center for Transitional Justice. So in some ways, I'm a bit of an outlier on this panel because most of my work to date has been in the field of international human rights, but focused, on, among others, reparations. I also focus on truth-seeking, acknowledgement, justice, and different forms of reforms to ensure that things will never happen again. Because if you broadly define the field of transitional justice, it's this idea that after a period of systematic, massive human rights violations, when there's a transition, either end of a conflict or a change in regime, we can't just turn the page and start from scratch. We have to acknowledge the victims. We have to look at what allowed those violations to take place. We have to take steps to repair the harm done and ensure it doesn't happen again. So I think that's just where I'm coming from, but I'm happy to say that while till now I've worked internationally, my organization has finally come on board after a 3-year struggle on my part to look at applying transitional justice in the U.S. I mean, I think it's a long time, but I think it's important. As you were saying, that there lots of people know the different types of stories, but we don't always put them all together. And I think the approach of transitional justice is really trying to look at how the past informs the present, and based on that helps you develop an approach for the future. So in the field of transitional justice, I think echoing what the panelists so far have said, reparations is so much more than compensation. But it's been interesting in working in different contexts. I work in Spanish, French, and my colleagues work in Arabic. When you try and find the translation for the term reparations, so often what the translators give us is compensation. And I think many legal cultures and legal systems have a tradition of financial compensation for harm. You do something to me, I sue you, and you pay me the damages. And so it's easy to default to that. But then when we're talking about massive systemic violations over generations, it gets a little trickier if you just reduce reparations to compensation, and sometimes that's the conversation stopper. So I think it's important that we broaden our understanding, and as you are all saying so far, it can be lots of different things, and I think what's important is that it respond to the harms and the consequences of that particular victim group or population that you're trying to work with. So, we sort of talk about reparations as taking different forms, ranging from material to symbolic and collective to individual. And generally our recommendation is that a good reparations program would try and take elements of each. So on the material side, there are things like pensions, payments, restoring civil and political rights. On the symbolic side, you have apologies, memorials, commemorations, renaming street names, there are many names, or like the issue in the US right now, the statues. Then also on the more collective, there's the issue of access to healthcare, to education, which was already mentioned, as well as more individual, erasing unfair criminal convictions, or for victims of disappearances, giving a death certificate, because without that, you can't sort of move on to certain access other benefits. So that's kind of very broad strokes, kind of the range. But if we're saying that, it's lots of different things and depends on the context, I think it's also important to not say what can be anything. What are some of the key elements of reparations? I think they've already been touched on, but just to echo that, I think it's important to see reparations as steps taken to recognize rights, the harm that was caused either directly or by the failure to protect those rights. And that reparations should be an acknowledgement of responsibility. I think both backward-looking and forward-looking. And what I mean by that, so it's an acknowledgement of responsibility for having failed your citizens, like I said, by either direct commission of violations or the omission to protect them. And this is a right that's established in international law. And then in terms of forward-looking responsibility, the responsibility to look at what allowed those violations to happen, what were the systems in place or the lack of systems in place that failed to protect these individuals' rights or groups' rights, and then what will you do to prevent their recurrence and address the consequences. So I think, for me, when I really step back and think what is the most essential about reparations, it's acknowledgement affirming of rights, and in some cases for the first time. This is, I didn't say reaffirming, because sometimes these populations have never had them in the first place, and so it's about establishing those rights. Then addressing the consequences of the rights violations. And on that, I think picking up on the point about how in Chicago you fought to have the grandchildren also access benefits. I mean, that's something I've done a lot in my work. I specifically focus on children and youth, so I've worked with former child soldiers in Colombia and in Uganda, and seen how there may have been some reparations to the person that suffered the direct harm defined as more torture or disappearance or forced to take up arms, but not really thinking about the ongoing consequences that will affect the children and grandchildren. And just to give you an example, so I worked with women in northern Uganda who were abducted as children by the Lord's Resistance Army. It's a rebel group that was fighting against the state for many years. And so when they were released, first of all, they were given amnesty for giving up arms, which is one contradiction because they were forcibly abducted and made to fight. But the way of getting them out was say, we're not going to try you, we'll give you amnesty. And once they got the amnesty card, that was their ticket to get some reparations benefits. They weren't called reparations benefits, and they aren't really, but they would get a mattress, a pound of sugar, and a little bit of money. And that was it. And whether you came out of the bush on your own after being there for 2 weeks, or with 4 children after being there for 4 years, you got the same thing. So that's already inadequate for that person. But we did a study just 2 years ago, 10 years after most of these young women sort of were able to either escape or be released from the Lord's Resistance Army. And what we found is that many of them had born children in captivity because part of the Lord's Resistance Army's effort was to create a new Acholi race. So there was an emphasis on forced marriage and forced pregnancy. So these women came back with 4 children. Sometimes the father had been killed or his identity was unknown, he was still in the bush. And Uganda is a very patriarchal society. So these children not only were stigmatized because they were the son of a rebel father, but then also they didn't know who that father was. So they had both like the shadow of the stigma without any of the access to land in a very land-based society. Mm-hmm. If you don't have land, you can't grow food, you can't eat, you can't go to school. And so I saw that these kids who are now, between 10 and 17 were getting blamed by the community for the violations the rest of the community had suffered. They weren't being able to access school. They weren't being able to access significant health care. And no one had really thought about that because these kids were 3 months when they came out. So I think that's just, in a very different context that doesn't really apply to the U.S., but just the point about the intergenerational consequence of harm. And I think that's something that has been very, very clearly documented in the U.S. by numerous scholars and experts on the topic. But for policymakers sometimes, and maybe more strict legal approach, it's important to really make sure that we understand the cascade of harms, which actually, from my perspective in Uganda, actually almost got bigger with time. There's this notion that time will heal wounds, it'll minimize it, but actually it was sort of like when you throw a rock into a pool and it makes bigger concentric circles and affects more and more people in broader ways that also are harder to trace back to the original harm. Mm-hmm. And so if you're not really looking and asking the right questions, you might think, that child's just poor. Mm-hmm. And that's why he's getting into trouble. Yeah. But you're not seeing, no, he lost his father, his mother was stigmatized, he wasn't able to access his basic services. He has no chance to really have a dignified life. So I think that's one point that those of us working in this, it's important to take the time to do the research, to speak to those that are affected, and try and connect the dots for those who don't want to see that. Because if you connect those dots, it makes the obligation even more real and I think bigger. I think, if we're thinking about why is it important to have a concept of reparations, I think it's essential for the context of this conference, moving beyond criminal justice and a narrow conception of punishment for harms done to really thinking about the enduring impact that needs to be addressed in the present and remedied for the future. And if nothing is done in the present, we're going to keep having those circles get larger and larger. So what can we do to stop that cycle, to remedy not just the now and the past, but again, ensure it doesn't happen again? we're also asked to, talk about successful cases of reparations. So I'm glad I can say that, Joey covered that for this case. Because what I was going to share with you is a bit more of a challenge. There are many cases of reparations. If you are interested in looking at international examples, in Chile, the system of pensions for former political prisoners. In our neighbor up north in Canada, they have looked at the legacy of Indian residential schools, which we also have in the U.S., the boarding schools, where indigenous children were forcibly removed from their homes and put in state-run schools, where not only was there cultural genocide, there was massive physical, sexual, psychological abuse. So they implemented a program of cash payments for all students of residential schools. You could also, if you suffered even more severe violations, you could, it's called an independent arbitration process. You could get more money if you suffered more harm. But then beyond that, there was truth-seeking, so to really try and provide a platform for these victims who had been so marginalized to tell their story and be heard officially and acknowledged. There was an apology, which again, people might question as it being insufficient, but it's all steps in that direction. So it was a massive approach to what it means to deal with the legacy of a past violence. But there is a challenge that is often underfunded or underprioritized. So in some of the contexts where we've worked, I think similar to the U.S., there's a lack of political will at the national level to acknowledge the harm, to even begin the conversation about reparations. So, the context that I've been working most recently, as I said, is Uganda. So I told you about sort of the violations and the consequences. But the president in power at the time of this conflict is still in power, Museveni, and he keeps changing the laws to allow himself to be a dictator forever. So there's no chance, even though he's said that he will do transitional justice work and then international governments fund it, it's just all talk and there's really no plan for implementation. So what we've done is tried a different approach. So even though it is important at some point that the national level, the state acknowledge what was done and how they failed to protect their citizens, right now there's no space for that. So what we're looking to do is be creative in the way in which local development policies can have a reparative effect. So there is an initiative to rebuild the North that was devastated by the conflict. And within that, there are certain policies that are supposed to give extra support to those affected by war. But what we found is that these women and children are so vulnerable and so marginalized that they're not able to even benefit from those meager programs or subsidies for farming that they should be entitled to. So what we're doing is we're working with these groups of victims to really articulate very clearly what are the consequences of the violations they've suffered and what are the obstacles they are facing to access some of these benefits to which they're entitled. And then on the other hand, working with these local government officials who don't have as much budgetary or political power as the national level, but they can do something small within their jurisdictions. And there are some that are open to that because their constituents are all facing this. And so they, in order to be effective in their work, they have to address it somehow. So it's not the ideal. It won't come with an apology. It won't come with the name reparations. But what we view it as a first step to getting some of those consequences addressed, and in that process also helping provide a platform and a space for those who've been so victimized and marginalized to claim their voice and make their demands known and keep advocating for this gradual process.
Great.
With that,
Thank you.
I wanted to give the other panelists the opportunity to respond also to some of the other things we've discussed. Whether they be kind of concrete examples, which we've heard some things about, and also, I think, again, why is it important for us to have a more expansive imagination about what constitutes reparations? Or anything you want to say.
You first. So I guess one project that I'll share that's still very much in so as a cultural organizer, I'm obviously thinking about this from one, the documentation piece of component of the process, and also what it takes to transform our culture in such a way that that we're able to speak openly and honestly about harm, making it a part of our conversation. 8 years ago, I went to Rwanda. And in Rwanda, I was doing some theater work there, and I remember every time that I would meet someone, they would say to me, "Do you know what happened here?" Referring to the genocide. And it struck me that people, in meeting you, wanted you to understand their history, wanted you to understand how the country got to this moment. And then on the flip side, they would ask me about where I came from, and because Rwanda is more east, they weren't as affected by the transatlantic slave trade, and so people would be like, "Where are you from?" And I'd be like, "From the U.S." I'm like, "No, before that." And it's like, "Well, I don't know. What do you mean?" Right? And over again, I would have to explain the transatlantic slave trade, and I had never talked about slavery that much in my life. And at first, it was like I would say it, and it was kind of like the way you talk about trauma, like when you haven't really dealt with it, it's just kind of like it was kind of disembodied. And then the more I talked about it, the more I would be asked, the more I started to feel it. Mm-hmm. Like we live in a country where we don't talk about it at all, and we talk about it in this disembodied way. And like the more I talked about it, the more I could feel it in my body, and the more like upset and emotional I became. And it was like, this is my history, right? Like, and we live in a country where we haven't really learned how to have this kind of conversation about slavery, about the legacy of slavery, about racial violence, and so for me, it's really important to create that right space, to build that muscle, to help people build that muscle, the muscle in which we can get into the practice of talking about the harm and make it a part of our regular practice, like that we can speak honestly and openly about it, right? And really have that be a part of just like what the conversations that happen in school, that happen at home, that happen in the workplace, right? And so storytelling is the way that I do that. Right. The project that I'm working on now, so one of the first mass story lab that I did was in partnership with the Close Rikers campaign. And that was almost 2 years ago when the campaign launched. And then continued to work with the campaign and wanted to understand, because like the relational piece with the storytelling, I get, and I've been doing that for 15 years. The instrumental piece is harder, right? As we've all been talking about in terms of how do you get to reparative justice or reparations. And so this year, we launched a new project in partnership with the Closed Rikers campaign called the Rikers Island Public Memory Project. So now that we know that Rikers is closing, it becomes super important that we define the narrative about Rikers, because we already see it slipping away. Little by little, it's like Mayor de Blasio decided to close Rikers Island, right? Like little by little, you hear it kind of like creeping in, right? The way that the state starts to co-opt the narrative, and suddenly it was like 10 years from now, it's like his whole legacy is like he closed Rikers, right? Unless we start a process by which we begin to define the narrative. And that's what the project is about. So my colleagues from Just Leadership are in the house, and so that's what the project is about. We're in the first year of it. It's a planning phase, which includes getting clear. Like as Cassandra said, we only hear one story, but there's so many stories. And so we're doing these story circles in neighborhoods who have been most affected by Rikers. We want to hear all the ways that people, those concentric circles of harm, we want to hear that. We want to know what it's like when your student comes back to school after a stint at Rikers. We want to hear what it's like when your neighbor returns home. We want to see all the ways that people are affected in the community, right? Starting with the people who have been detained at Rikers, but then everyone around them is affected. If you ask anybody that's done time at Rikers, they'll tell you that you're never the same. You come home and you're never the same. And that's true of many of our jails, right? But Rikers, the closure of Rikers gives us an opportunity to create a memory process in which we get to capture that impact. So story exchanges, public forums throughout the year, getting feedback from the community about what does reparative justice look like. How do we want to remember Rikers? What does that look like? Does it, what are the symbolic and the material forms of justice that we want to create? But it's a long-term kind of process, and we're very much at the beginning of it. And so I'm excited that we are now having these conversations in a U.S. context, because so much of this work has been international and human rights focused. But there's so many great, I've taken so much inspiration from the work that Joey and her colleagues in Chicago have done, and having an example of how we can do this in a U.S. context, the work that's happening in Ferguson, the work that Equal Justice Initiative is doing, creating a living history of where lynchings have happened in the South, also making the connection between the legacy of slavery and mass incarceration, drawing that line for us. And I hope that there's more of that. I think the challenge that I find myself sitting with constantly kind of speaks to what Cassandra said about, like, you never hit the bottom, right? Because this country is built on a foundation of white supremacy and racial violence and slavery, racialized capital, right? Like slavery. How do you so often we think about this in like the context of one incident of harm. But we're talking about like an entire country founded on harm. And so that is really our work and our challenge, I think, in creating these kind of processes.
So I have so much to say based on what everyone else has brought. I mean, I think when we first started thinking about doing a reparative justice campaign around the drug war, we went to ICCJ and we met with some of your colleagues, and I remember someone being like, look, like, this doesn't fit in the U.S. context, right? That we go to places that have had armed conflict. And it was so interesting because at the time, the only people on my team were Black. And I could not fathom having someone say to me, a Black woman, that I wasn't living through armed conflict. Right? Like in the years of Trayvon Martin, Sandra Bland, Rakia Boyd, like, I was just like, how can you look at me and say that this isn't armed conflict? That people aren't running up into my homes, right? That they aren't taking us apart. And then it reminds me as to why I'm still in the journey of trying to figure out why human rights law even means anything to me. Right? Like, really understand, like, really struggling to really figure out how that concept relates to someone that was 3/5 of a person. Right? So what does it mean to be a Black person in the context of the U.S., remnants of the transatlantic slave trade, right? And then for me, having a pit stop before I even got to mainland U.S., from my parents being from Haiti, right? And then being, Black, being Haitian descent, but being culturally African American, right? And like really understanding like what does human rights even mean to me, and the fact that even within the United States context, that human rights is not something that we even talk about. So oftentimes when people talk about human rights, I'm always like, well, that's for not me, right? Like, that doesn't even seem like it applies to me. So the whole idea of like we have to hold the United States to international human rights law doesn't make any sense to me, since the United States is such a huge empirical power that they don't give a fuck about the thing that they wrote about. Right? So we're consistently looking outward and not looking inward. And the fact that human rights has been used as a way to recolonize people from the U.S. perspective, as someone who's Haitian. Like, I know what it means for the United States to continuously occupy the lands and pay attention to the elections and put the people that they want in power. So human rights for me is like, okay, whatever, girl. That doesn't really, I don't understand it. So that conversation is something that has been super important to me. And then I think the other thing for me is that when I hear everyone say, like, part of the biggest tenets of reparative justice is that it can never happen again. If we're going to say it's never going to happen again for the drug war, then that means we need to legalize drugs, period.
Yep.
Right? If, like, that's it. Yep. There's no way for you to continue. If there's no way to guarantee that the drug war will not continue to happen unless we remove drugs from the conversation, because the drug war was never about drugs.
Still ain't.
Right? It's just never been about drugs. It's always been around the people associated with things that we could criminalize them for. And so if we're going to say that we can't have the Burgess trial or the Burgess tortures to never happen again, then we can't have police. Then the part of the imagination is thinking about how do we want to respond to drugs that does not use criminalization? How do we want to create public accountability that does not use law enforcement? There's nothing to restore and repair in the relationship between law enforcement and people when law enforcement was created as slave patrols. Like, it doesn't make sense. And so when we talk about, like, how do we not know the history, right? People aren't thinking, like, there's no way to repair policing, period. There just isn't. They're just, like, why are we pretending, like Miriam Kaba continuously says, like, there's no such thing as racist policing. It's policing, period. You don't need a modifier. The structure is racist. So why do you don't say bad, you say bad. It's like, it's racist, right? Like, the drug war is racist, it's classist, it's sexist, it's imperialism, it's colonization. You can't get reparations. You can't fight for reparations without being an abolitionist. Reparations is an abolitionist stance. So it's like, if we're going to say, like, we can't let this happen again, then part of the imagination is not just how we respond to it. It's not just how we memorialize it. It's not just making sure it doesn't happen again. It's imagining what do we want in its stead. So when people, like, when the Close Rikers says, you know, it's not just about closing Rikers, it's about building communities, right? Like, people always want to show up for the closing Rikers part, but nobody wants to show up for the building communities part because it's hard. So when I talk to social workers and I talk to treatment providers and I'm like, what would treatment look like without the drug war? And people can't give me a vision, we're in trouble. Right? Like, we're just in trouble. Like, what does accountability, how do we deal with harm without state-sanctioned violence or state-sanctioned actors? We can't even, we don't even want to have the conversation because we're so committed to how the structure is created. Like, y'all, if we're not, it's not just closing jails and prisons. It's closing child welfare, like, straight up. They are kidnapping our children. Like, when we're talking about, they are kidnapping the basis of social work was about kidnapping children. It is systematic, generational genocide created in a system.
And surveillance.
Surveillance. Because now we're cool with close down the prisons, but here, take an ankle bracelet. Because we're not imagining how to create accountability outside of the state. So when we talk about reparations, think about what families that have lost their children and loved ones to the police feel when they get a civil suit. That's not giving their loved one back. And the state treats it, they'll write the checks. NYPD, they don't care. They'll write all these checks. They write them all the time. And there's been nothing to address it.
Nothing.
They will legalize weed tomorrow, and you will have another Eric Garner on Tuesday. So how do you imagine policy? Even my job has limits because I'm imagining within the structure. But how are we creating outside spaces to imagine what it would look like outside of a legislative process, outside of the accountability process that we've created? I don't even think that I have the capacity to think that broadly. Because I'm not convinced it's my generation. My generation has the capacity to do that. I think it's what I want to strive to, but it's the difference between being born in the internet and learning the internet. Right? Like, part of that conversation, like, there's something generational that's happening. Like, I'm not making it to the promised land. Like, I'm not making it. I'm clear. But my goal is to get us a little further to it. And so, like, I don't, like, when we talk about reparations and we think about these processes, if we're not also talking about abolition in the same breath,
That's right.
then we're not having a full conversation about reparations.
So the goal was just to get us thinking. I'm going to open it up now because I know you all have questions and are fired up. And but first, let's just thank us for sharing. So I'm going to, where I can see everybody here, just open it up. And I see the sister back here.
First of all, thank you all so much. This was a great panel discussion. I really enjoyed everything that you all said and your perspectives. And I have a comment and a question. So a couple of days ago, I saw on the news that in South Africa, the president announced that they're reclaiming the land from white farmers with no compensation. And I wanted to know your guys' take on that from a reparations standpoint. Is that like a first kind of like drop in the sand and it's going to spread? Is that the type of thing that we're hoping for? The second thing is I'm so glad you brought up intergenerational like movement building, because I don't think we talk about it enough. We sit here and think that we're going to have a success within our lifetime because we're working hard and people have worked hard for us, and that's our hope. We don't really talk about how we really need to start planning over generations, setting up the next generation to move forward what we won't be able to do in our lifetime. I'm just like really just so happy she said that, and I hope we can continue talking about things in that way. So those are my comment and question.
I'm not taking a South African question. You're the international expert. Yeah.
Do we take a few or?
Yeah.
Like a couple?
So, okay, well, let me just hold on to that. This response to the South Africa farmers' land and the intergenerational piece in our movement building. Right, so, okay, well, hold on to that. And then there was a hand here. Yes.
I just thank y'all.
Brittany.
Hey, Brittany.
Hey, Brittany.
But I just have a couple comments to add to this. Like, we're talking about in the U.S., our bodies have always been fugitive. And so this whole entire conversation around reparations is adding on to it as around, like, we also have to think about the internal genetic type of dysfunction and chaos and how it shows up in our communities, period, right? And then two, you mentioned, Piper, about the close records narrative being shifting, is somewhat shifting away. It makes me think about this process of this narrative being shifted away as violent and how it shows up as violent, right? And I don't think we never hit the bottom because in our organizing, the organizing methodology is from a white perspective, right? When we talk about the Underground Railroad, we say how they do it. We don't say they organized. When we talk about the Black Wall Street, we say how they do it. We don't say they organized. And so our entire conversation around reparations should be including these narratives, these perspectives, like the Saltwater Underground Railroad that had fugitive slaves going into the Bahamas and Haiti and Jamaica for freedom after slavery was abolished. That is not inside of our analysis around reparations for ourselves, and we create the shit ourselves.
Yeah, that's right.
So I think it's about expanding that type of our conversations in that. And then also too around like state-sanctioned violence is only going to get worse. We're talking about beyond the bars, but what we're seeing now in the U.S. is ICE is actually renting beds out
Yep.
in the jails.
Yep.
So the evolution of mass incarceration is happening, and it's deportation because of a person's
That's right.
citizenship.
That's right.
So we can sit here and talk about reparations and like what is that conviction process? I don't have any answers, but like this just makes me think about all of these in real time.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then here.
I'm trying to use this thing. Hi, everybody. I'm a child of state violence, so I'm a descendant of state violence. I was born and raised in China. My grandfather was persecuted a number of years for being implicit in some political party work, and as a result was incarcerated for multiple times. My family immigrated to the United States because of part of that legacy and the legacy of the ongoing oppression of state violence inside mainland China. Which is also playing out to this day, where the current presidency is coalescing and consolidating power to become a lifetime ruler of the state. And my family came here to seek refuge, right, to seek the mythology of this nation as a nation with rights and democracy and freedom. And of course, we're peeling back the layers, and that myth is a lie. And so if we're talking about the state is built on a lie, then the fundamental system that needs to be disseminated or deconstructed seems like the state itself. So we're talking about the ending United States as a nation state. If we allowed our sort of imagination to play out long enough, if we're ending incarceration and we're ending systems of repression, then we're talking about the end of the nation state that is the United States. Which is like a terrifying prospect for me to have, because I came here seeking some kind of refuge, right? And there are certain systems in place that I have, for reasons that have nothing to do with me, have benefited from by playing by the rules to become a citizen. So there's a level of radical imagination that almost has to go beyond the existence of the nation state that is the United States. So I'm curious about that level of radical imagination of turning towards something that is actually talking about a post-state existence.
Before we go to the next questions, are there any responses from the panel to anything, any of the comments? Joey?
Well, I'm not going to say I'm an expert on South Africa. I did have the opportunity to visit in June with Prexy Nesbitt, who's done a lot of work with South African liberation movements. And, I want to say, what I feel and my understanding right now is there are some groups right now who want to start talking about truth and reconciliation with regards to police violence and the criminal injustice system here in the U.S. And I'll just be honest, it makes me really concerned, this idea of just having truth and reconciliation. Because, I think I don't want to take away from the power of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, and I think it did an amazing amount of work to really document and prove the truth of the racist and violence of apartheid. But there was no accountability for those who committed those acts of torture and atrocity, let alone the daily violence of apartheid that occurred, and there was no reparations. And so, therefore, now this idea that white farm owners are losing their land, that there has to be a process of wealth redistribution. And as people are saying, I just want to say, I think reparations opens up this idea of imagining the world we want to live in, and there's no one set way to do it. And it is about reimagining, a world without the nation state. Okay, But I also want to say, I'm a little bit of a lawyer. As a lawyer, I'm a little pragmatist. I think that there are reparations campaigns that we can do now that can take power from the state. Yes. And that is what the reparations ordinance was for the Burge torture survivors. We did not feed the state. We were not calling for prosecutions. We were not saying that the city should have more money for police. We were not trying to say that we want civilian oversight of the police department. What we were saying is you need to fund the needs of the survivors, and you need to give us the funding to build the building blocks that maybe can become empowering institutions to take the struggle to the next level. And so, that it's a process. I guess I also want to say the way we got to reparations was we didn't just sit down and I didn't just pen to paper to write this ordinance. What we started off by doing was having a call for speculative public memorials, where we asked people to submit their ideas, their imaginations of what memorials would look like, and we got 70 submissions of what those would be, and we held we held them at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and we displayed these submissions of what memorials would be. And some of them were architectural design, some of them were photography. Someone sent us an aloe plant and said, salve, that's what reparations would look like. We had people who submitted syllabi to us about how they would teach about the Burge torture cases and the resistance of the survivors and family members who fought against it for decades, how you would teach about that in art history or an art class in high school, or how you would teach about it in an international human rights class. And that's really, I think, what fed us to put in the reparations ordinance, this process of asking for the schools to teach about the Chicago police torture cases. I want to just also say, for the Burge torture survivors, so many of them were tortured, and they then went to court and they testified and they said they were tortured. And each and every time their claims were denied, and the judges believed the white police officers over them, right? And that act of denial, that act of told you're not telling the truth, that act of disbelief was a harm in and of itself.
That's right.
Yes.
That's right. Yes.
And so for creating what was originally just an idea of asking people, how would you publicly memorialize these cases, created what you say, a container, as Mariam Kaba says, a container where we invited torture survivors, family members, organizers, educators in to re-educate ourselves about the Burge torture cases, to hear from the survivors and the family members of how they were harmed. And in that process of putting those survivors front and center and letting them tell their stories and letting them be believed and letting them be embraced by the communities at every one of these events, and we had hundreds of them over the years, was an act of healing for them. Mm-hmm. And so now that we have reparations, I can tell you so many of the torture survivors, it's not perfect, but feel embraced, that's right, and feel committed and feel invested, because now they realize they are not the people the state demonized. Mm-hmm. They are not created by their narrative, but they are part of this narrative where they are loved, where they are valued, mm-hmm, and where they are believed in. Yes. So I've learned so much from this campaign. I'm still learning from this campaign. But for me, when I think about the war on drugs right now, it is not enough to decarcerate, which needs to happen, and it is not enough to just legalize. No. Those are two important steps, which I agree. But right now, we're going to have all of these dispensaries of marijuana that are going to be white-owned and white-run, mm-hmm, and that are going to make millions and millions and millions of dollars. Mm-hmm. And I think the challenge for us in thinking about the war on drugs is to imagine what would reparations look like, mm-hmm, where the state has to provide compensation to the to the individuals who are criminalized for the very same thing that people are selling legally today.
Yes. That's
right. Where are the healing centers for individuals? Right. Mm-hmm. Where are the resources going to be put in to the Black and brown communities that have been stripped of individuals for decades? Where's their educational grants? Where are their business loans? Mm-hmm. Where there's so much to think about in terms of the generations of harm. So again, I'm not going to say international human rights is perfect, and I'm not going to say that the reparations model is perfect, but it gives us a new paradigm. It shifts us from just thinking about what the legal system provides us, which is very little at best, but to think about a much wider scale. And what I think it does is it allows us, so many more people with all these different talents and creativity and imaginations, to come into the table and fight alongside of us and imagine what can be.
That's right. I agree with all of that. And I agree with all of that, and I would say that that's why everyone should go to www.colorofpain.org, which is the campaign that does exactly that, right? And it's why internally within our organization, we've fought to be like, it's not when we legalize marijuana, it's how we legalize marijuana. And that's why when we pushed for the initiative in California, $50 million go to communities most impacted by the drug war, and why we worked with Crystal People-Stokes to do the Marijuana Regulation Taxation Act, which says 50% of the revenues go to communities most impacted by the drug war, looking at Rockefeller and looking at stop and frisk. But I think, so I agree with everything you said. The one thing that I want to leave with is to your point about intergenerational organizing, and to your point, Brittany, about like talking about organizing from the lens of, through Black people, right? I think I can only speak, I'm Black, so I'm only going to speak for myself as a Black person. I think every Black person that is born, period, is an intergenerational organizer. Because everyone that was stolen made choices. Everyone that stayed on the boat and everyone that jumped off the boat, they made organizing choices. And if you don't see yourself as their generational plan to survive or to stop hurting, then you're not living in the full truth of the sacrifice that they made. You understand what I'm saying? Like, it is not by mistake that I'm sitting here. When people wear the t-shirts, like, I am my ancestors' wildest dream, right? Like, when people say Black Lives Matter, what I'm saying is, you don't have a choice in it. You were born. And in that born is that fight, is that revolution, is that FU to the state, is that FU to state violence, just being present. That's why they try to kill us so much. That's why you see Black maternal health being what it is. So much of that is still in us. So whether we talk about it or not, and we need to talk about it, I think part of the realization is, for Black people, and anyone born out of imperialism and colonization, is that your mere presence, your mere presence is you attending the fact that you are part of an intergenerational strategy.
We just have a few more minutes, so I want to make sure I get to this sister here who's been very patient, and I didn't see anybody over here, this brother here. So let's take these 3 comments or questions.
Hello? Oh, okay. So I'm Luan. I'm a part of the New York City Revolution Club. And considering that we live under a system of capitalism and imperialism, which constitution was built with actually 2 economic systems in mind, the economic system of slavery and capitalism. And the fact that, in looking at, even at solving this problem, we actually can't look at it inside of a vacuum. We are now living in a situation where we saw the Klan marching in the streets in Charlottesville, where we saw a whole new rise of white supremacists marching in the streets, actually claiming and fighting for, in essence, a fast genocide to happen. And now, recently, with the attacks on immigrants, it's actually legal now for undocumented immigrants to be detained indefinitely. So the question does pose itself, well, shouldn't we keep this in mind, and shouldn't we actually be, fighting to stop the people who are in power, who are enforcing this? And I just wanted to also put the challenge out to people, because, there actually is a movement that's out there that is organizing to stop that, and that's refusefascism.org. And there was a film that was put out by the revolutionary leader, Bob Avakian, "The Trump-Pence Regime Must Go. In the Name of Humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. A better world is possible." And one more thing right before I stop, I'd just like to say I want to talk to you, brother, because I do believe that we need to get rid of America and everything it stands for. And I'm not saying now, but that needs to be something that needs to be talked about.
Okay, thank you. Let's get to this brother here. Yes.
But I love you. You gotta say that because I see you hurting too. I'm hurting. I mean, as soon as you said that, it hit me. So I mean, part of like being hit or being hurt is healing. So let me be the first one to say I love you. And that's part of it. And I don't let enough people say that. That's right. We love you. With land, kind of like when everybody was kind of with contrasting with land and reparations, things like that. I'm thinking like Mark's Garden, things like that. You were talking about, being that was Underground Railroad. What would you think like land would look like right now?
This ain't Black people's land to take. This is First Nation people's land to take. We just have to be very honest about that.
So getting back to the Native American?
Yeah.
Okay. There was another hand here. Yes.
Yeah, and it's actually connected to both the men over there's comment and these two. I was just saying, in light of what he said and what they have subsequently said, do any of y'all see it as being even possible to reform, sufficiently transform, rather, the legal system within this country in a way that harm is dealt with within the context of the United States as it is, or do we need a radical transformation of the state?
Okay. Thank you. So we're going to allow the panelists to comment, and then we have to take off. Yeah.
The thing I hate about panels is it really does set up this kind of, this false assumption that we actually have the answers, right? Like, so I just want to be clear that we don't have these answers. Like, if you left here today feeling like, whew, oh, thank God Cassandra got me together, I know now what needs to happen. If you leave, no, that's not going to happen, right? This is a collective project. No one person has, if one person tells you they have the answer, they are a damn lie.
A liar.
They are lying. This is a collective process, a collective project, which means that we have to figure it out together. And what happens over time, right, is that as we continue to be pushing ourselves within our movements to evolve in the way that we think about, in the way that we think about justice, and the way that we think about how we arrive at abolition, the complete abolition of systems of racial violence, right? Well, as we continue to do that, right, like as long as we continue to be in the question, then we're moving in the right direction. And I know that we want an answer, right? Because it feels better to have an answer. But we really need to be in the questions. Yeah. We don't spend enough time in the questions, right? Because this is like 400 plus years in the making, what we're talking about, all right? So we're not going to get there overnight. But the work that we're talking about in committing to a collective process of imagination is how we get there. So I encourage us all to leave here and take these questions, take this conversation to the people closest to you and have these conversations, right? Within your family, within your workspaces, all over. There are conversations that are happening in my family right now, speaking of intergenerational work, that I never would have dreamed it would have been able to happen. When I was 18, I came out to my family and told them that I had been sexually abused as a child. And no one could handle it. And they shut it down. They shut down the conversation. Last Thanksgiving, over dinner, we talked about the cycle of sexual abuse in our family. That was 20 years in the making. The healing of that was 20 years in the making of me doing my own healing work, of me continuously bringing forth the conversation to different people, and then to the point where we could actually heal enough that we could have an open conversation. We're always organizing within my family. Like, I had a cousin who had tickets on her car. And we knew what that meant if she had to drive in order to get to work. We knew what it meant if she drove with those tickets, that she was going to get arrested. And so we put together a cousin fund. Everybody pitched in some money, and we paid off our tickets. My sister is on probation for a drug charge. And rather than be angry and pissed off that she got in trouble, I was like, what can I do to support you? She's like, I need money for daycare. These are the things that we can do right now that transform our relationships with the people that we love and that move us in the direction of liberation. But we have to move beyond the rage and the shame that paralyzes us and keeps us stuck where we are in order to do that. And that's so much about what this work is about, is letting people know that they belong. Right? That they belong and that they deserve to be well. And then demanding that the state recognize that and demanding that they're accountable for the harm that's been done. And that's where we are right now. And I can't tell you what that work is going to look like 20 years from now.
Right.
I'm hoping I'm sitting in the back just watching some people do their thing and figuring it out.
Thank you so much. This is a beautiful place to end. Thank you all very much.
No. I was like, you're right.
No, you were Brooklyn and you try to get the trains right, and I was just I should have taken the one, not the 8.
Right?
Me too.
Yeah. Talk about that. I love to connect.
Me too. I love it too.
Talk about Thank you.
I had so much to say about the child welfare. Everything we do is social work, it's clinical work, mental health work. We'll have this conversation.
Yes, we will.
Inspired by you. I'm going back to the next
Okay.
My name's Dion. I am from Oregon. I have nothing like this going on.
Can I give you my email?
Yes, please.
Okay, I would love to be in contact with you.
Yes, please.
Okay.
I'm just ready.
Can I?
Oh my God, we do. Thank you.
Thank you. And my
I'm always confused how y'all live.
thank you.
Yeah, we gonna go into there.
Thank you for having me. It was really an honor.
Joey Mogul, that's my name. M-A-O-Y.
J-O-E-Y.
M-O-G-U-L.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I'll get it.
Awesome.
Take it over.
Hi, I'm Julia. I emailed you the bio. I'm actually from Chicago. I'm a founder of Chicago in Florida. You work with Eva? Yeah, Eva's great. But ask me to say hi. Yeah. hearing you talk is really great. And, like everything. I met that intern.
Oh, awesome. Well, thanks for everything that you did.
Oh, no. I saw the from Chicago. So yeah, it's been nice.
Great. Thanks for
Thank you for coming out. I will be moving back to I know, it's super interesting. Because